My name is Musa Delelenya. I'm the officer in charge of the UNCTAD office here in New York. And I'm pleased to present the list developed countries 2013 of UNCTAD titled Growth with Employment for Inclusive and Sustainable Development in LDCs. Now, the gist of the report is why, even during boom periods, when there is robust economic growth, we don't see impact on poverty reduction in many of the least developed countries. And this report has been investigating the question as to why, especially in the case of these countries, why growth is not generating or having impact on poverty reduction, and why it is not generating employment with higher wages. As you know, there are 49 countries which the UN categorizes as least developed countries. Just for your information, 34 of which are in Africa, 14 in Asia Pacific, and 1 in Caribbean. Now, in this presentation, we will look into the key policy messages and recommendations from the report. We will reflect on the economic trends and outlook for the coming years. And we will look why growth is not generating employment, and why we don't see as I said, impact on poverty reduction in many of these countries. And in doing so, we need to look into the challenges related to demographic trends, employment trends, and finally, we look into also what sort of policy agenda is necessary to address the gap between growth and employment and poverty reduction. It is the very notion of the LDC concept was the result of the seminal work of UNCTAD. It was UNCTAD's work that led to the establishment of the category in 1971 by the General Assembly. And since then, UNCTAD has been in the forefront of advancing the trade and development interests of the poorest countries of the world. So the LDCR series, or the LDC report, in short, we call it LDCR, is a source of policy analysis on trade and development challenges facing these countries. And precisely this series report examines the link between investment, growth, and employment. It proposes a three-pillar policy framework. One is to look into the broad policy, macroeconomic policy environment, to see or to look into the industrial policy at the center, where the structural economic transformation is the key, and it looks into also how public-led actions would create employment and then will have lasting impact on poverty. So in terms of the policy messages, what we have been saying is the decades-long policy preoccupation, which is stabilization, which is open market regime, which is deregulation, privatization. For us, it is not leading to jobs. And the growth we have seen in LDCs in the last couple of decades is actually a jobless growth. It's totally a jobless growth. This is the characteristic phenomena of these countries, and consequently what we see is the Belgian demographic trends. We see persistent poverty. Then also we see accelerated urbanization and rising inequalities, which made remunerative employment difficult in many of the countries. The second key message, what we are saying is even the external economic environment is not conducive for many of these countries. There is weaker demand, especially after the crisis of the 2008, 2009. There is heavy dependency on commodity production and export, and there is excessive volatility of commodity prices, and there is also huge increase in terms of import. There is unsustainable debt burden and the declining official development assistance, as well as volatile capital flows. All these compounded further the challenges of poverty reduction and inclusive growth and sustainable development in LDCs. So there are both domestic and external factors which made growth failing below expectations in terms of having impact on poverty and also in terms of generating decent employment. The third key message from the report is there is a kind of demographic explosion in LDCs. In 2011, the total population is about 858 million, which is roughly 12% of the world population, which doubled between 1980 and 2010, and which is projected to do so by 2050. And the current growth rate of 2.3% is the highest in LDCs, is the population growth, as compared to 1.2% in other developing countries and 0.4% in developed countries. 60% of the population is under the age of 25. So it is this population which is also projected to reach 1.7 billion by 2050. Youth population, which is between 15 and 24, is also projected to increase from current 168 million to 300 million in 2050, which is an increase of 131.7 million. There is high fertility rates in these countries, which is 4.4%, 4.4 children per woman, which is almost twice as high as the global average, the world average. And the work age or working age population is estimated to increase by 16 million every year. Now, the fourth message coming from the report is the role of agriculture, which is traditionally or historically the source of employment and livelihood in many of these countries diminishing over time. And consequently, we see more and more people leaving the farm area, leaving the rural area, and entering to the urban centers in search of jobs outside of the agriculture sector. Then what this implies is that not only the population increase is a problem, but there is also increasing urbanization in many of these economies. And such a trend calls for a paradigm shift. This is the bottom line is such a kind of adverse trend requires or calls for a paradigm shift in development policies and the strategies in these countries. And we will look into what sort of policies and actions are necessary to address the challenge. Now, in terms of recommendations, again, from the report, before getting into actually the core of the substance or the substance of the report, the recommendations coming out of the report is that job creation should be at the front and center of the development policies in LDCs. So far, the emphasis is on growth. You invest to achieve a certain level of growth. You liberalize economies to increase your export level. Everything is about growth. The preoccupation of the policy so far is on growth. What we are suggesting now is employment should be seen as an integral part of development policies in many of these countries. So we will look at the nexus between investment, growth, and employment, actually, as we go along. To generate quality jobs, what we have been saying as well is LDCs need to build their productive capacities. If they don't have the core, the minimum productive capacities, they will not generate employment. And if they don't generate sufficient employment for their growing population, which we have seen a little while, then poverty reduction will be difficult in many of these countries. So any policies will not have any dent on policy reduction efforts. So this has to be also seen in terms of the UN processes in crafting or articulating the post-2015 development agenda, which should put also employment at the center of national and international policies and strategies. The macroeconomic, industrial, rural, and infrastructure policies in many of these countries are also geared towards generating employment. And we will look how to do that. And effort is to increase investment in education and training, including technical and vocational training, must be seen also as integral parts of the policies and recommendations for these countries if they have to generate minimum adequate job with higher wages so as to impact poverty, the level of poverty in these countries, which we'll be looking in a minute. So as I said, the post-2015 development agenda of the UN also should put both a momentum, should provide a momentum and a means to enable LDCs to generate employment, achieve poverty reduction, and inclusive growth. Now, the paradox which the report is going to address is LDCs have been achieving higher rate of growth. In the chart, you will see between 2002 and 2008, the growth rate LDCs surpassed 7%. This is the highest by any standard. And during the 2008-2013, it is slowed down to a little, slightly over 5%. And now it is reviving again with the revival of the global economic situation after the crisis. So it's still the LDC's economic growth by the standard of either developed countries or developing countries is the highest. But what we see is there is the 7% growth is not generating a kind of, we will see in a minute in a graph, a kind of job that it was supposed to generate. So there is huge gap. The employment rate in LDC is currently 3%, while the economic growth is 7%. Such a high gap has never been seen in any of economic developments or in any of the category of countries which we deal with. So generally, just to shorten on the graphs, what we have to look actually is this graph. The other graphs, I think I will leave it for the sake of time, maybe also to give you time for questions and answers. We will make available the PowerPoint presentations. So what you see is this is the economic growth, which is, as I think, the 7% which we talked about. In the middle, you will see the unemployment rate. So there is 7% growth currently, which is the highest, as I said, but the employment generation is at about 2.9% or closely 3%. So there is huge gap between the employment and the job. So the propensity of growth, the capacity of economic growth to generate employment is low or weak in many of the least developed countries. Not only there is a lag in terms of generating jobs, but there is also a variation, a gap between labor productivity. Labor productivity in LDCs is the lowest. It is 22%. This is output per worker. It is 22% less as compared to developing countries. It is only 22% of the output that a worker generates in developing countries that the LDC worker could generate. It only generates 10% of the worker the same worker in the European Union area, and only 7% in the North American area. So the productivity of labor, the output per labor in LDCs is actually the lowest. So one worker produces only 22% of a worker produces in other developing countries. It produces only 10% of the worker in the European Union and 7% in North America. So there is a variation in terms of productivity of labor. The other problem in LDCs is the informalization of the sector. So the largest proportion of employment is generated in the informal sector, which means the jobs are insecure, the wages are low, and the skill requirement is minimum. Generally, 80% of the total employment is in the vulnerable sector, or what we call it vulnerable employment, which is either it's owned by the family or it is self-employed. So 3/4 of the total employment, which is 75% of the total employment, is also working poor. What it means this in terms of dynamics in poverty reduction is that what you see in the right-hand corner is the proportion of people living in extreme or abject poverty in LDCs, which is 53%, which is less than the internationally defined line of 1.25%. What we call moderately poor, it's between this is accounts about 23%, and there is a near poor, which accounts 17%. So what we see, in a sense, the middle income, the middle class, is only 6%, and relatively high middle class is only 1% of the total population. So what it means is this pervasive poverty, as we see in LDCs, this generalized poverty in LDCs, is the result of the weak employment, which the economic growth, which the highest economic growth we saw a little earlier, is not generating sufficient quantum of work in the countries. So what are now the issues that the policy should address? How the gravity of unemployment, lack of progress in terms of meeting the Millennium Development Goals, especially the reducing by half the level of the proportion of people living in abject poverty, and what are then the policy agenda that have to be pursued so that economic growth will have impact on employment, it will have impact on inclusive growth, and then it will ensure a kind of sustained growth and development in the countries. So one thing which there is agreement now is the consensus is such a trend cannot continue. So it must be reversed, and it is crucial to reverse it. So without economic growth, if economic growth is not creating decent jobs, then sustainability is difficult in LDCs. That growth is fragile. That growth that we saw is not all-inclusive. That growth we saw is not contributing to poverty reduction. Employment, we think, is the best way to address the abject poverty, the pervasive poverty we saw, the massive poverty level just we saw in the case of LDCs. If employment is going to address the growing poverty level and the social instability and the social conflict in many of the other countries, then we also look into how that addresses the mass international immigration, which we can't afford to ignore. So basically, again, the policy challenge is to focus and adopt employment-rich growth as a major objective in the coming decades or so. So this is the kind of virtuous circle which the report is arguing. That basically the policies that these countries have been focusing so far is investment for growth. Investment for growth. That was the preoccupation of the 1990s, the structural adjustment programs, and then the poverty reduction strategy papers, many of the liberal deregulation policies, privatization policies. The core objective is to address economic growth, to attain maximum or higher level of economic growth. So employment was relegated to secondary level or tertiary level in many cases. So this is what we are saying now. There must be a nexus and a virtuous circle between investment, growth, and employment. Always the entry point is investment. So the core for generating growth is investment, and the core, again, to generating employment is investment. So it is crucial that the government lead the investment portfolio in many of the countries because the private sector is just too little and too weak to generate the amount of investment that is needed. The other thing what we are seeing is to revisit the industrial policies. The so-far industrial policies focus generally in LDCs either on the micro or the small enterprises. So there is no medium-sized enterprises. The foreign investment coming is having a bigger, relatively bigger enterprises, and there is a missing middle. So we have been arguing that the missing middle, which is the medium-sized enterprises, should be given both the policy attention and the requisite finance to generate employment and to contribute for poverty reduction. The credit policy have to be reviewed, and both monetary policy and fiscal policies should work in tandem to generating employment and to enable the growth and expansion of the private sector. As I said, in all these efforts, government should take the lead. Basically, the private sector, as I said, is the capacity of the private sector is just too little and too small to address the magnitude of the problem that we have seen. So although in the short term, again, the private sector, the role of the private sector is too small, too little, but we see in the future that the growth and expansion of the private sector would generate larger economic benefit and employment to the countries concerned. I will stop here. So the rest is enterprise policies, which we talked directly or indirectly, the focus on the missing middle. And this is basically, in terms of the donor support, the report is also calling a kind of matching funds to provide finance, training, especially for the youth, and especially the youth and the firms that are creating employment. So we are also calling revamping the rural development policies. Generally what we are saying is job creation should be at the front and at the center of development policies and strategies in these countries. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you for giving us this press conference. My name is Edith Lederer. I'm the Associated Press chief correspondent here. I have two questions. First, you mentioned that in the LDCs, the fertility rate is 4.4, which is more than double, or at least double
the global average, yes.
The global average.
Yes.
Is anything being done to try to bring this down, which would certainly curb the population growth rate and this bubble of young people, especially, who can't find jobs? And secondly, why is there such a huge disparity in productivity in the least developed countries, even compared to the developing countries?
Thank you very much. Should I address these questions first, and if there are any follow-up questions, then we will go together. I think in terms of fertility rate, you know there has been efforts for many years to address this issue. What we see with more education, with flow of, increased flow of information, what we noted in earlier work is that in urban areas, there is a declining trend in terms of fertility. But still, as you know, the 80% of the population in most LDCs lives in rural area, and still the high fertility, the natural growth, is coming from the rural area. I think 20, 25 years before, I think the average fertility rate was, I think, 6.6%. which is unimaginably high, and it went down slightly, but it's still a long way to go in terms of family planning, in terms of sending more girls to school, also putting it's always a sensitive issue. Having the right age for the marriage and child rearing or childbearing. These are the kind of issues that have to be addressed. But still, we feel it is the highest. It went down slightly, but effort is in terms of family planning, population control. This have to be re-energized, and it has to be continued, because with this kind of rate, it is extremely difficult for these countries, even during good times, to provide a job for the youth bulge, which is unimaginably higher than what the economy would afford. Now, the productivity gap has, it is a kind of, many factors involve productivity gap, productivity of a worker. One is the nature of work that you yourself do. As I said, when 80% of the employment is in informal sector, when 80%, 75, when 75% of the total poor is actually a working force, and many factors complicate and affect productivity, labor productivity. But generally, there is, over the years, the gap is narrowing. Actually, it was huge, I think 2 decades before, between, I think, 1980 and 2010, it was one of the highest in terms of the gap, the productivity gap between the LDCs and other developing countries. It's narrowed down a little bit. Now it is only 22% of the output per worker, which an LDC worker generates, as compared to developing countries, other developing countries. But it's still, that we feel is the high and high. It's the training affects labor productivity. The kind of technology that you use affects labor productivity. The conditions of the worker will affect whether is in full health and good health, to contribute to output and production. This all affects the labor productivity. It is a kind of multi-factor, multi-dimensional issue that have to be addressed to improve labor productivity in these countries. But as I said, the gap is narrowing, but still we feel it is one of the highest. Yes, please.
Yes, Evelyn Leopold, my colleague just stole my question. No, I wanted to elaborate on the women's aspect. I mean, youth unemployment is horrible in Europe also, and they haven't been able to solve it quickly. But I'm wondering why part of UNCTAD's program and all the things you list is not health clinics for everyone, especially for women, one-stop shopping, reproductive health, maternal mortality, the entire child bride syndrome, that's not a central point in UNCTAD's program.
The women productivity in many of LDCs, I was looking for the data. I think women have, in the language of the expert, is more propensity to work than men in many of the LDCs. So generally, in the workforce, in the labor market currently, especially in the rural areas, 80% of women are directly or indirectly employed, and generally these employments are not wage paying. Whether it's child rearing or whether taking care of the family, these all are full-time jobs, but they are not paid for this one. But the point is how to address that women, particularly In fact, the report also shows that the propensity of women to work is 80% in many of the LDCs, while that of men is just 75%. And women productivity also increased over the years, I think close to from 52% to 57% to 62%, while the productivity of men also actually diminished in many of the cases. So women are central in the workforce. And in terms of the work program, women, when we talk of entrepreneurship, we are not talking only for women. And in fact, we have one of the largest projects and programs, what we call is Empertech. This is Empertech is the system which assists not only the creation of enterprises, but also in the formalization processes, meaning from the graduation from the informal sector, which again, the largest concentration of women workforce is in the informal sector. So it has to be formalized. There must be a process that would allow women to graduate from formal to informal. But we have the gender component in the program, and there are many women who have graduated. We have successful. I think next week there is going to be a kind of women award, Women Excellence Award in Geneva, where women excelled in terms of creating jobs, in terms of also leading businesses. So there is a work program which addresses also the gender dimension in UNCTAD.
No, my question was why the health dimension for women and men is not a big part of your program. I mean, women die in childbirth in every LDC and leave families, children wandering around or in extended families, and the men can't work if they're not healthy. And I'm wondering why that is not a big part of your program, including reproductive health.
Look, UNCTAD is the UN agency that deals with trade and development. So we don't actually deal with the health issue, the family planning issue, actually, because there are designated and specialized agencies such as the WHO, UNFPA, and others. So our area is to look into, in terms of policies, what sort of policies should these countries adopt in terms of generating inclusive growth, which means basically, again, the large workforce is women in many of these countries, and what policies are needed and required to address the gap. But in terms of women health, women protection, child education, women education, these are not really within the core areas of UNCTAD. We can generate policies, we can advise policies, but these are not the areas for UNCTAD's work program. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hello, I have two questions.
Okay.
The first, it seems like making the agricultural sector look more attractive to the younger generations to increase jobs is a big part of this report. But it also mentions sort of like technology capacity building as something positive for development. So are there any examples of developed countries that are assisting with technology capacity building in the LDCs? Also, the UNDP, it seems like it does a lot with agricultural training and development. And I think that they expanded their South-South cooperation agenda recently. So how can UNCTAD and the UNDP help agriculture look more attractive to the younger generations in the LDCs in order to create these jobs?
Okay. Thank you very much. This is a very good question. It cuts across agriculture and also in terms of policy remedies, which we put is the technology component of it. I think the first thing to make agriculture is, I think we have to look why agriculture is giving away its dominant share in terms of employment. I think that is the key question. One is there is a population bulge, as you know, which we looked at, and over the time, there is a declining farm sizes. So now, a lot of people in a small plot of land, which also contributes to the diminishing role of agriculture, because agricultural productivity in LDCs actually significantly declined over the years, because it's not providing a minimum not only in terms of employment, but in terms of generating other auxiliaries, such as food and food security issues, in terms of contributing to the environment protection. So the role of agriculture is generally diminishing and declining. There is lack of resources, investable resources to improve and modernize agriculture. There is no integrated rural development programs. There are no rural services in terms of health, sanitation, even education in many of the countries that we are looking, then which makes people difficult to stay within the agriculture sector. Now, the other challenge, which I didn't show you in one of the graphs, actually, it may be good to look at it. I don't know how much time we have, is we see a kind of convergence between the urban and rural population. This is the graph, actually. I don't know how visible it is. We see there is increasing urbanization. What you are seeing in the dotted line is the rural population. And the one below is the urban population. So what there is, because agriculture is not providing a livelihood for the growing population, there's an influx of people from rural to the urban centers in search of jobs. And that is making even the urban areas more difficult to sustain life in terms of now the urban centers. Urbanization is not actually akin to modernization in the case of LDCs, but it is akin to having a large concentration of people in poverty, crime rates increasing, and maybe also social tensions growing. And there is huge gap between the haves and the have-nots because there is there is a kind of disproportionate access to economic opportunities in many of these countries. So agriculture generally the role of agriculture is generally diminishing over the years. So it is not only for the UN, but for the national governments as well. It is important to make agriculture development central to their own policies. So in many countries, you see agriculture, as I said, is generating 80% of the livelihood or 80% of the population living. If you see, for example, the amount of loan disbursed from national banks, from government banks to the agriculture sector is minuscule. It is less than 1% in most cases. So there is a kind of policy disregard from the government themselves to the agriculture sector. If you see the allocation of official development assistance from developed countries to many of the poorest countries, the huge share is going to the services sector. It's not to productive sector. In fact, the share of agriculture from the ODA and official development assistance and investment flows is declining over time. So there is huge resource mismatch between the needs of the agriculture and also what we see in terms of agricultural development. There are various programs. The FAO has huge, massive rural integration, rural development, integrated rural development approaches. The UNDP has, as you said, a lot of agriculture-based programs. We ourselves advise in terms of policies and kind of things and at sectoral level. So generally, the work of the UN is to advise countries, and it's up to the countries actually to squarely place emphasis on their agriculture sector. Because mind you, the policies that we have been suggesting are not a kind of one-fits-all sort of approach that we are following, because each country's condition is different. The resource environment is different between countries. Although LDCs are economically, they are the same, there is heterogeneity across the countries. So each country should look into which sector is central to their own development course. And specifically in this case, to address the kind of gap between employment and growth. So the technology, there are examples through the South-South cooperation. There is massive investment this time in terms of modernizing and enhancing the role of agriculture. There are a lot of farm technologies getting into the agriculture sector, but we shall see the impact of all this if they are going to reverse the kind of traditional or historical role that agriculture used to play. And there are classical examples, and some of the projects that we saw some wonders where there is a coordinated approach between donors, international agencies, and countries at the country level that have reversed the course. And we saw in many of the countries where a kind of triangular cooperation between the countries, UN agencies, and also the government, where they actually reversed the declining trend in agriculture, specifically in terms of attaining food security in many of these countries. Thank you. Yes, please. So I think we better go randomly. So, yes.
Well, just a quick question about the report's recommendation.
The recommendations. Okay.
Yes, the report says that it is the responsibility of the national governments and the LDCs to provide and create jobs. But realistically speaking, do you think that these governments are in position or have the economic capacity to create 16 million jobs each year? And at the same time, doesn't it go against the privatization efforts that now it's pushing the countries in least developed countries to go more toward the privatization rather than more government-centric? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. When we see this is not really to return to the old kind of government is the only provider of jobs, or government-owned enterprises are the only source of employment. I think that was a failed strategy, and that we are, in fact, we have been advocating not to return to this kind of a strategy. But when we say governments have a role, they have a bigger role, because job creation, if you don't have the right policies on the ground, then whatever international support you will have, whatever amount of resources that you generate, it is difficult to translate that part of that portion of economic growth to generate employment and then to contribute to. I will give you a practical example. Why we are saying government have a role is still government in these countries is the largest investor, if you quote unquote, both in terms of infrastructure, for example, developing rural infrastructure, roads, building institutions. Still government is the largest financier of this sector. So if you don't have a strategy to absorb your own labor into the investment, into the financing that you are putting, road construction, for example. If you bring high tech to build a road, if you bring foreign or expatriate workers to build the roads and the bridges, or if you are not providing a minimum resources to develop drainage systems in the rural areas, if there is no irrigation facilities, then these all are financed by the government, and that's why we are saying in the short term, government has a primary responsibility to generate jobs for the growing population. Now, look also the services sector. Who is the main provider of the services? Whether it's electricity, whether it's sanitation, water, sewage system, all are the government is the sole provider of these services. And unless you have the policy to encourage employment in the sectors and the services that government is running, then that is a failure, policy failure. But we are not exclusively saying that in the long run, the government should withdraw gradually. When the private sector develop, when enterprises formalized from the informal to more formal, when the small enterprises grow up and become medium enterprises and large enterprises, they have to provide employment. So it is a process that takes, so in the short run, still government has a bigger role to play. We are also suggesting a donor and international organizations approach to create a kind of fund, a pool of fund, where, because one of the problems which which undermines the growth of enterprises of lack of resources, lack of credit facilities, lack of financing. So to create a kind of pool of resources where enterprises and those entrepreneurs actually who have the capacity to generate jobs, who are willing to improve the livelihood of the population and contribute to sustainable development, will have access to such resources, such a pool where donors provide money, and particularly enterprises and firms that create jobs for the youth, especially. So youth training and kind of thing. So it is a kind of a multi-pronged policy approach which we are advocating. But again, in the short and medium term, government have a specific role to play because they are the sole investors, they are the sole financiers of some of the infrastructure facilities, some of the services, they are the sole providers. So in the medium and short term, they have huge responsibility in terms of generating jobs. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
Actually, you kind of like answer my questions. I'm Lucia Chen from IPS. So my question is about education is a huge gap. Also has a huge gap in Africa because you talk about investment is pretty important in have the job have the employment to be grown there. But things is like they don't have enough like teachers or any educational resources over there. So what if like the foreign companies they want to bring in like the money to the country? They also bring their own like persons or they also bring their own staff. So what would you do? And then like what would the government grow less dependent to this international investment? And according to a report, like the international aid, it's actually dwindling in the past 3 years, from 2008 to 2013, 5 years, sorry. So I mean, how the government could just react more to this the dwindling international aid and become more independent.
Yeah, these are very good questions, broader questions. I think in terms of education gap, there is in some of the countries that we looked closely, even when resources are available, the share that goes to education is minimum. That is one of the problems they have. So that requires also a kind of policy change to put also the education as one of the priorities for national governments. And I'm talking of countries that could generate enough resources, enough investable resources. If you look into the countries that are producing and exporting oil, there is huge revenue, but you see the proportion of that revenue that went to education is minimum. I don't want to name the countries, but there are classical examples when even resources generated from local sources are not put into the right use to the right purpose. That's one. And the second problem is also what kind of education we are providing. So the type of education that we are providing, the kind of training that is necessary, including the vocational training, that is absolutely essential. Instead of producing the people job seekers, that the whole education sector have to be reoriented, that anyone coming through that process would become a kind of job creator, actually, with that someone that creates job for himself. So it requires, it's a very key issue that you are touching, not only bringing experts to train and but we have to create a kind of condition that the knowledge from the experts is transferred to the locals, and so that locals will generate their own kind of momentum to address the gap in education. So it is a big issue. As you mentioned, that LDCs are dependent on ODA. Yes, there is a problem, but still we are encouraging. If you look at the report, we are advising them to make more efforts to generate even local resources, what we call it domestic resources mobilization, which is key. Because even in many countries where we saw there is huge resources wealth, in terms of natural resources wealth, what you see the poverty gap is huge. So this have to be addressed, that we have been separately advising countries that are able to generate adequate resources to make it in good use, both for employment generation, improving the education, improving the health standards of the people, and addressing also the kind of poverty that we see. In fact, in some of the countries that now the income reach close to the income per capita level reach about $15,000 in many of the one LDC, but still you see the amount that goes to education, health, and general public services is minimum. So again, international support, not only in terms of finance, but in terms of ideas, in terms of policies, and in terms of advising, and in terms of training the locals, is still key. So in a nutshell, there is a big issue. This is a big issue that have to be addressed by national governments themselves and also by the international community whenever it is necessary. So I believe that we exhaust all the questions, and thank you so much for raising all these interesting questions, and we look forward to 2014 report again. So thanks.